As the airlift was being lowered into position, Margaret Rule told me about the search for the Mary Rose.
The search for the Mary Rose began in 1965. It was initiated by Alexander McKee, a local journalist and author, and we were looking for the ship for 5 years until we found her in 1970. She was first identified, or the site was identified, using submud sonar to send out acoustic signals which penetrated the mud and reflected back off a buried unknown object, which was in the correct place, in the right position and the right size to be the Mary Rose. We've been working out here, as you see us today, since 1970, tossing around most summers. But last year and this year, the first 2 summers that we've been able to do a full season, a full program of excavation. This year it will be something of the order of 50 to 60 days, and last year we did 55 days on site.
Now, for example, this year, what's your program at the moment?
Our program at the moment is to dig a large excavation outside the ship, on the port side at the bow. It will be an L-shaped trench, which will go along the port side to the stem, and then we'll turn across the bow, we hope, and find the starboard side of the ship. All of this excavation will be outside the hull. The object of it is to see how well the hull is preserved, how much of the ship remains there in position, and whether it has high enough mechanical strength to be raised.
Now, at this point in the summer, how much progress have you made?
Well, really, at the moment we've done all the donkey work. We've got the machinery and equipment here, the grids are laid out, these heavy weighted grids within which we excavate, and we're taking off the topsoil, the overburden of soft silts and muds. We're about 1 metre and 1.5 meters down in very large trenched area. From now on, we shall be going down through the old scour pit of the ship, which will contain a lot of derived debris from the breakup of the superstructure, and I imagine that after about a week or 10 days' work, we shall be down to the keel level.
Most people diving on the wreck are volunteers. There are sub-aqua club divers, some of whom have given their time and equipment to the project for 5 years or more. Several archaeologists who've learned how to use air bottles, wetsuits and flippers were also on board. I spoke to Sally Statham, a volunteer from a university sub-aqua club, and Andrew Fielding of the St Andrews Institute of Maritime Archaeology before they went over the side in their diving gear.
We're going down on a survey exercise. We've got lots of loose timbers lying about in the trench we're excavating, which will have to be lifted before we carry on the excavation any deeper. And we're going to triangulate them in from the frames of the side of the ship to plot their positions before lifting.
Now, these were timbers that fell off the side of the ship and are probably 3 or 4 feet, or perhaps even further away from the actual shape of the hull.
That's right, yes.
Now, Sally, what's your job going to be down there?
To help Andy as much as I can, because it's surprisingly difficult to work underwater if you've got a long tape measure or something. If you're measuring, say, 2 meters, then you've got to fix the one end of the tape before you can read off the other end.
Now, you're a straight up and down archaeologist, aren't you?
Yes.
You've worked on sites on land.
Yes.
This must seem rather bizarre, working like this, certainly from this platform. Tossing about out here in the Solent, it all looks rather bizarre from an archaeologist's point of view.
Yes, it does really, but the actual work on the seabed is no different. You still use the same methods, the same techniques.
But you have the most extraordinary problems to overcome.
Yes, visibility, the amount of time that any one diver can actually work on the site. Even the site supervisors can only work for 85 minutes on the seabed. And obviously, if you're only working for 85 minutes, you get a very fleeting glimpse of the work that you're doing at that particular time. And you're very reliant on what each individual diver records while he's working down there. There's a diver's line that goes straight down to the scaffolding area, which defines the limit of the excavation. And we each know our way. We could find our way around the excavation blindfold.
Just as well.
Some days you have to.
Because there's no visibility at all.
Yes. And Sally knows which frames I want to measure from first. And she'll just go straight there. I'll take all the measurements I want from that frame. And then Sally will move on to the next one.
But most of the time you'll lose sight of her.
Oh, yes.
You'll be attached by what? A measuring tape?
Yes. Yeah. We try not to attach divers to loose bits of line because there's so much down there. The scaffolding poles, airlift mooring ropes.
It's very easy to get tangled up with them.
In fact, it's probably more lethal to be tied to your buddy diver than it is to be totally separate. If you want to come to the surface in an emergency, for instance, and your rope's tied round a bit of the scaffolding pole, the surface is 50 feet above you.
Now, you're taking down with you a sort of clipboard here, but
it's made out of stainless steel to prevent rusting. But apart from that, It's similar to any notebook that a land archaeologist might use.
Except that can't be ordinary paper.
No, it's plastic paper. Most land archaeologists these days will be drawing their plans onto plastic paper, permatrace. And we write down all the measurements that we want to take before we go down, so that we know exactly what we've got to do, and just enter in the measurements by the side of the frame numbers that we want to measure.
What do you use to write with?
Just an ordinary lead pencil.
It's slow going because, as Andrew Fielding said, divers are allowed only 85 minutes a day. Any longer could run them into health hazards. Margaret Rule, who learnt to dive in order to supervise the archaeology involved in the project, explained what they can see on the bottom.
If you came down there with me today and you swam down, at seabed level you would see the tops of the frames, the ribs of the ship, very eroded, very worn away, and then about half a metre down in the mud you'd see the side planking begin to occur, and just a couple of the side planks, and then the bottom of our trench. So you'd be looking at the side of the ship well below the waterline on the port side. There's a lot of collapsed superstructure, debris lying in the trench. We're digging the muds away very carefully from these timbers and triangulating them in to fix their position to see how they relate to the hull as it survives. And as they are cleared of the mud, then we're bringing them up, recovering them, and they're being taken to our conservation workrooms for cleaning and recording.
What do these timbers look like when they come up?
Well, the ones we've brought up so far today are very, very eroded. They're eroded by mechanical attrition and by gribble and by teredo, and clearly they're the side timbers, the ribs of the ship, which stood proud above the seabed after she sank. And it would seem that when she sank, she settled into the mud, she's heeled right over on one side. We're looking at the port side. She lays on her starboard side in the mud. She's heeled over at 60 degrees. And these upper side frames of the ship, which were exposed above the mud, have become so attacked by marine organisms and by silts and by muds and by seaweed washing past them. This was in the late 16th and possibly the early 17th century. And they finally collapsed and disintegrated. And you can see all this wear on them when we bring them up.
When you do get them up, and when you get enough of them up, will you be able to reconstruct what the ship must have looked like?
We can learn a great deal of detail from these timbers because the fastenings, the holes where the fastenings were are still there. The trennel holes of the oak pins which held the ship's framework together are still there. So we can learn a lot of dimensional details from these upper timbers. Of course, when we excavate down, the hull, which is buried in the mud, is in immaculate condition, quite different. If you look at the side of the ship that's buried beneath the mud, it's like looking at a Tudor sideboard. The wood is immaculate. We can see the marks of the carpenter's adze. The seams are so tight together that you can't even take a sample of the caulking compound if it exists. She's tight and sound, and the wood has very high mechanical strength. This is where the hull is buried in the mud, and it will certainly take any strain of lifting.
Margaret Rule and her team would like to raise the hull exactly as it is, so that this unique microcosm of Tudor life could be examined under controlled conditions ashore. But as Basil Greenhill explains, there'll be problems of preservation.
You come up against the fact that wood which has been under the water for a long period of time and has become waterlogged, if it's dried out without special treatment, distorts, changes its form, and as a result, the vessel herself ceases to be intact as a vessel and breaks up into distorted pieces of timber. The only way to stop this is to replace the water which has permeated the wood structure, to put it in very simple terms, with some substitute. And the one which has been used on the Vasa and other finds in Scandinavia and has been used in this country as well is a wax-like substance called polyethylene glycol. Now, if the wood is in a reasonable condition, it's either evenly decayed and not too badly decayed, you can do this job fairly simply using polyethylene glycol. But there are many other ways of doing it as well, some of which are at the present moment very experimental.
The cost is certain to run into millions of pounds, and as yet few people on the project have dared to wonder where that sort of money might come from. That wreck buoy in the Solent may be there for a very long time, protected by legislation which should keep her safe from looting. Other wrecks around the British Isles have not been so fortunate. The law as it stands still enables a determined salvor to disturb the site of an historic wreck in the search for treasure. It's a problem that worries many maritime archaeologists, but it's a threat that seems to be receding. Keith McElroy believes that the large majority of divers are now on the side of the archaeologist.
This has been one of the most encouraging developments of the past 4 or 5 years. It is now quite standard for the Council for Nautical Archaeology to hear very early on about discoveries by amateur divers. I myself act as archaeological advisor to the British Sub-Aqua Club, and am informed very promptly of any developments which are notified to the headquarters of that organisation. And so far I've had nothing but the most tremendous help from any amateur who has contacted us regarding how he should proceed and deal with the site he's found. We'll take a site like the Trinidad Balancera, for example, discovered by the City of Derry Sub-Aqua Club in February 1971, and they kept absolutely secret about it for over 2 months until they had identified the relevant archaeological expert, in this case Colin Martin from St Andrews, and got in contact with him, arranged for him to come over and arranged the first lifting of the surface finds, the bronze cannon in that case, and their survey before the public got to know of it, before there was any threat of interference from other parties. And this, I think, is the model of the way we should be going in the future.
The future of maritime archaeology will continue to lean heavily on the services of volunteers. As a branch of archaeology, it's very much a Cinderella of the sea. There's very little money available except from charitable and private sources. There's virtually no career structure for archaeologists who wish to be wet. And with the cutback in government grants for land archaeology, there seems little hope of extra funds being channeled underwater. Dr. Toby Parker of Bristol University feels that we could look closely at how the French handled their ancient wrecks.
They have, it's really a branch of the Navy with a commitment to archaeology, and they have a full-time ship and diving staff with archaeologists to control their field operations. And this means they have the ability to get on site and look at sites as soon as they're reported, get an assessment of them. And this is something we don't have any corresponding facility for in this country at the moment. They actually award the use of their research team to projects which have to apply for it. In other words, there's an element of competing on academic grounds for particular projects. Very often they go for the more unusual sites, but most of their sites have been either in prehistory, where they've been looking at submerged Stone Age sites, particularly in the Channel, on the north coast of France, or else they've been involved in classical shipwrecks in the south of France.
Now, if we were to have such a service, what difference do you think it could make?
I feel it would enable the Department of Trade and Industry to get an immediate and reliable assessment of new sites when they're discovered, and it would be possible, therefore, for us to get a good and correct catalogue of the sites of genuine historical interest around our coasts. Every month we hear of new discoveries which expand the field of marine archaeology. This summer we've heard now of a Bronze Age site in the south coast of England. This is perhaps the second Bronze Age wreck now known from this country. We're moving out into fields of medieval, classical and prehistoric sites and shipwrecks all the time, both in Britain and overseas.